All right, so are you ready to jump into this conversation between Bernie Sanders and Bob Scheer?
Oh, yeah. Always fascinating to hear what Shear pulls out of his guests on sheer intelligence.
Yeah, he really gets people to, kind of unpack their worldview and their ideas, and this one with Sanders is no exception. There's a lot to cover here. We're going to be talking about, big money in politics, this idea of a progressive wave, strategies for pushing back against kind of this divisive form of populism we're seeing, both here and around the world.
Definitely some weighty topics, and Shear doesn't hold back.
No, he does not. And Sanders, he meets him head on with some really, really striking claims.
Like right off the bat, Sanders dives into the Koch brothers.
Oh yeah, he does not mince words. He basically says that Trump and his allies are basically implementing the Koch brothers agenda, especially when it comes to, these social safety net programs.
Yeah, those are the big ones like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid.
The ones that millions and millions of Americans rely on.
Absolutely. And what's really wild is that Sanders points out that most Americans actually oppose these cuts.
Yeah. It's almost like this disconnect between what the public wants and what's actually happening in Washington.
Well, and Sanders attributes that to, the power of these billionaire donors.
Right. It's like they're the ones calling the shots.
And he goes even further than that. Sanders argues that the Kochs and their allies aren't just trying to, like shrink these programs.
Right.
They want to get rid of federal support altogether.
That's like a completely different vision of what government should even do.
Right. It's not tweaking the system, it's dismantling it.
No Social Security, no Medicare. That's a pretty radical idea.
And then there's privatization. He mentions the VA and the Postal Service, as potential targets.
Yeah, he really sees this as like a trend, a worrying trend.
Like where does it end?
Well, that's where it starts to get even more philosophical.
Yeah.
I mean, he sees this push for privatization as like undermining the whole idea of government being a source for good.
Right, like the idea that government should actually, be providing these essential services and looking out for the public interest. It's a pretty fundamental shift.
Okay, but then how do you square that with this surge in progressive energy that Sanders keeps talking about?
Yeah, that's the really fascinating part of this conversation. It's not all doom and gloom.
No, he sees this tension, between these powerful interests and this growing movement.
And he's actually really optimistic about the potential of the grassroots to push things in a more progressive direction.
He points to a lot of examples like the $15 minimum wage, Medicare for all these massive infrastructure investments that are being talked about.
These aren't fringe ideas anymore. They're really gaining traction.
Yeah, even Medicare for all, which used to be like this, pie in the sky concept.
Right, totally dismissed as unrealistic.
And now it's like this mainstream policy proposal. It's pretty remarkable.
It does make you wonder, though, how does that translate into actual change?
Right, because as Sanders points out, we're up against this wall of money in politics.
Oh, he doesn't let us forget that.
No, he throws out this statistic from the 2016 election that just blew my mind. For every dollar spent by, labor unions and public interest groups,
Right, the little guys.
corporations and the wealthy spent $64.
It's an insane imbalance of power.
Yeah, it's like David versus Goliath, but with like a really, really, really big Goliath.
But Sanders doesn't just complain about it. He's got some pretty radical ideas for how to fix it.
Oh yeah, he lays out some solutions.
He talks about overturning Citizens United, which, many people see as having opened the floodgates to corporate money in elections.
Right, and he doesn't stop there. He also calls for, like a complete overhaul of campaign finance.
Right.
And he even floats this idea of public funding of elections.
Like completely changing the way we fund campaigns.
It's like he's saying, let's level the playing field. Let's make it so that everybody has a voice.
It would be a huge shift.
And then there's this whole issue of voter suppression, which he sees as part of the same problem,
Absolutely. It's about limiting who gets to participate in democracy.
especially people of color and low-income communities.
Yeah, and Sanders sees that as a deliberate strategy to rig the system in favor of those who are already in power.
It's like a 1-2 punch. You limit who can vote, and then you drown out the voices of those who can with tons and tons of money.
It's a pretty bleak picture, but then Sanders shifts gears a little bit and starts talking about this rise of authoritarian populism.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting.
He's not just focused on the U.S., he sees this as a global phenomenon.
Right.
And he argues that it's fueled by, people's very legitimate anger and frustration with a system that that seems rigged against them.
Yeah, you've got this system that feels corrupt and unresponsive to the needs of ordinary people.
And then these charismatic leaders come along and they exploit that anger. They scapegoat minorities. They pit people against each other.
And that's a really dangerous recipe.
And that's where Sanders really wants to push back. He believes that the only way to counter this kind of populism is with a message that brings people together.
Yeah, like instead of focusing on these differences, he's talking about building solidarity among working people.
Emphasizing their shared struggles.
Like we're all in this together, you know?
Right,
Mm.
and building a movement that goes beyond these traditional, party lines.
And focusing on the things that actually affect people every day.
Economic justice, access to healthcare, climate change,
Like, let's get back to the basics.
the stuff that really matters.
And here's where Sanders' background as an organizer really comes in.
Oh, yeah. He's not just about, diagnosing the problems.
Right. He's got some ideas about what to do about it.
He talks about this dual approach, one for those who are, inside the system and one for those who are working from the outside.
Okay, I like that. So what's the strategy for those on the inside?
Well, he's calling for them to really challenge the status quo, to push for bold progressive policies and to refuse to be beholden to these corporate interests.
So like really leading by example.
Yeah, showing that a different kind of politics is possible.
But what about those of us who aren't, elected officials? What can we do?
Well, that's where he gets really fired up. He says, organize, run for office, build a movement.
We take ownership
You need to take ownership.
and demand change.
He even calls for this 50-state strategy.
Oh, to revitalize the Democratic Party.
Right. And this goes back to that point we were talking about earlier about how Democrats have essentially withdrawn from 25 states.
Yeah, that was pretty mind-blowing.
What are the implications of that?
I mean, that's a huge chunk of the country.
Sanders and Scheer both see that as a major strategic blunder.
Like they've just abandoned these areas.
And allowed Republicans to just solidify their power in those regions.
So it makes it even harder to advance a progressive agenda at the national level.
Absolutely. If you're not even contesting elections in half the country.
Right. How can you claim to be a truly national party?
Well, and Sanders thinks this is partly due to this focus on appealing to moderate voters
Like in swing states.
at the expense of building a strong base everywhere.
So he's calling for a more expansive vision.
One that doesn't write off entire regions of the country.
Yeah, and this connects to his critique of the media, right?
Absolutely.
If corporate media is only focusing on certain issues in certain parts of the country,
It contributes to the sense of disconnect.
between the political elite and everyday people.
And Sanders is really critical of the way that corporate media covers or doesn't cover economic issues.
He thinks there's this obsession with political gossip and personalities.
And the bread and butter issues that matter to working people get sidelined,
He uses this example of the $80 billion increase in the military budget.
which got hardly any attention in the media. How can we justify spending that kind of money on weapons when people are struggling to afford, healthcare and housing and education?
Right. It's a perfect example of how corporate media often fails to prioritize the issues that really matter to people's lives.
It makes me think about how easy it is to get caught up in the horse race of politics,
Who's up, who's down?
But we need to step back and ask ourselves, what are the real issues here? What kind of future do we want?
And that's what Sanders is urging us to do.
To be more informed and engaged.
To demand better from our leaders and from our media.
He starts talking about the power of grassroots movements, and he brings up this example of Jeremy Corbyn in the UK.
Who really mobilized young voters.
Yeah, it's a reminder that change can happen,
From the bottom up.
even when the odds seem stacked against you.
And he really emphasizes the importance of individual action.
He's like, don't underestimate your own power.
You can make a difference.
And he gives some really concrete advice about how to do that.
Starting with local engagement.
Not just national elections. Run for school boards, city council, state legislature.
Those are positions that often get overlooked.
But they have a huge impact on people's lives.
I never thought about it that way.
It's the level of government that's closest to the people.
Where you can really see the impact of policies.
And he encourages people to step up and run for office.
Even if you don't have experience.
Bring fresh perspectives.
I love that. New voices, new ideas.
But even if you're not ready to run for office,
Right.
there are other ways to get involved.
Like organizing.
Mobilizing at the grassroots level.
Putting pressure on elected officials.
Standing coalitions.
So many ways to make your voice heard.
And even if you're not a natural-born activist,
Yeah.
you can still support organizations that are fighting for social and economic justice.
Donate, volunteer, spread the word.
Every little bit helps.
Yeah, and when you think about that 50-state strategy and the need to re-engage in rural communities,
Right.
it makes you wonder, are there issues that could unite people across the urban-rural divide?
That's a really interesting question.
Like, are there common ground
Well,
issues?
Sanders talks about things like college affordability and access to healthcare
Yeah,
as struggles that affect people from all walks of life.
regardless of where they live,
And he thinks that these shared experiences are often overlooked by the media,
which tends to focus on the things that divide us.
rather than the things that unite us.
Yeah, if we could shift that narrative.
Focus on common ground.
Oh.
Who
Yeah.
knows what's possible?
And he makes this really important point that it's not enough to just be against something.
Oh, okay.
You have to be for something.
So what does that mean?
It means that progressives need to offer a clear vision.
Of the kind of society they want to create.
It's not enough to just criticize the status quo.
Right.
You have to present a positive alternative
So it's about painting a picture of a better future
that people can believe in and fight for.
and connecting that vision to concrete policies and actions.
It's about being both aspirational and pragmatic.
Dreaming big, but also being strategic. That's how you build a movement that can create lasting change.
This whole conversation has really gotten me thinking about the power of individual action.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problems we're facing.
Right.
But Sanders reminds us that each of us can make a difference.
Absolutely.
And he ends the conversation with this powerful call to action.
Yeah.
He challenges us to reflect on our own values and think about how we can get involved.
In our own communities.
It's not about just passively consuming information.
It's about taking action.
Using what we've learned to create positive change.
This has been a really insightful conversation.
Yeah, I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of Sanders' worldview.
And his strategies for creating change.
Me too.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that this is just a snapshot.
Of a much larger conversation.
There's so much more to explore.
In Sanders' work and in the broader progressive movement.
But for now,
Let's move on to the final part of our deep dive.
where we'll explore those questions that Sanders leaves us with.
About how we can each make a difference.
Stay tuned.
Mm-hmm.
So we're back, and we've been digging into this conversation between Bernie Sanders and Bob Scheer.
Really getting into Sanders' take on the influence of big money and this rising tide of progressivism.
And now he kind of turns the tables on us.
Yeah, he doesn't want us to just walk away feeling like, okay, I learned something.
Right.
He wants us to grapple with what it all means on a personal level.
And he does this by asking some really pointed questions.
Like, what are the local issues, right here in our communities that resonate with Sanders' message about, economic and social justice?
It's like he's saying, look around you. What do you see that needs to change?
How can you get involved and make a difference?
And he's not talking about, just writing a check or posting on social media.
He's talking about real tangible action.
Volunteering, attending city council meetings, supporting candidates you believe in.
The stuff that really makes a difference at the grassroots level.
And this is where it gets really interesting because he keeps coming back to this idea of the 50-state strategy.
And how Democrats have basically retreated from 25 states.
Right. Essentially ceding ground to Republicans in huge parts of the country.
And he poses this question that I haven't been able to shake. What happens if this continues?
What are the consequences for our democracy?
Does it mean that certain voices, certain communities are just systematically excluded?
And if that's the case, can we really even call it a representative democracy?
It really challenges our assumptions about how the system is supposed to work.
This whole conversation has been such a powerful reminder that we're not just, spectators.
We have a role to play.
We can shape the future we want.
Whether it's running for office, organizing, having those tough conversations.
It all starts with us.
So let's take Sanders' challenge seriously.
Let's get involved, stay engaged.
And keep fighting for a more just and equitable world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope you found it informative and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
Remember, change starts with each of us.
And together we can make a difference.